I want to thank you very much for coming to our office this evening and for coming to the 6th installment. We want to ask everyone to turn off your cell phones and turn off your pacemakers and everything else you might have in case for when we get into this thing. This is the 6th of a series we're doing called Harlem Speaks. And what we're doing is featuring folks. Where's that? Okay. What we're doing is we're featuring peoples whose lives are intersect with Harlem and with jazz in many different ways. Last week we had Joe Wilder, a well-known jazz trumpeter, was here. And this week we're kind of in uncharted territory, and in the sense that we're expanding our purview. The co-producer of the series is right here, Mr. Greg Thomas, well-known person, great writer, and we're working on a number of projects. And between the two of us, we've been arriving at the folks that we want to have as guests. One of the people in the first series that Greg recommended was Alvin Reed, who's the owner of the Lenox Lounge. And his story is as fascinating as the story of a musician, because what most folks don't realize, as you realize, I'm preaching to the choir here, is that the jazz world is not just us musicians. I'm a saxophone player myself. First time I toured Europe was with Panama Francis's band in 1983. Remember
He's her father.
This is your dad, right? We have Panama Francis's daughter is here. One of the that was one of the first times I wound up in Europe with a jazz band was with your dad's band, and I was very, very proud to be in that band. Most people think that jazz is just the story of the musicians, but it's not, because someone has to be a band leader, someone has to have a club so jazz musicians can play, and especially back during the glory years of jazz, there were dancers. And for those of you who actually experienced dancers actually dancing to a great jazz band, I guess you know there's absolutely nothing like it. There's a tremendous interplay between the way that a band plays and the way that people dance to it. And before we bring out our guests for this evening, I just want to give you a little bit of background if this is your first time up here to our office. We're 3 years into our project of trying to build, I wouldn't say trying to build, but building a jazz museum in Harlem. And we have materials on the wall. You'll see photo montages of our last 5 events. And we've got a press kit we can show you. We've had coverage in the New York Times and the Amsterdam News and Harlem World, and also in the New York Sun and different places. Had a lot of good press. And we're just working very hard. Unfortunately, this evening, this is a 2-man, 1-woman operation. It's Leonard Garman, who's the chairman of our board of directors, myself, and Wilhelmina Grant is our, that's it, that's our staff. And unfortunately, Mr. Garman is a little under the weather this evening. He sends his best to everybody, and I'm certain he'll be here at our next one. But he sends his best. He's very sorry he couldn't be here this evening. I'm going to introduce our guest in just a moment. But I want to do it by highlighting one interesting fact. Most people don't know that there was a jazz museum in New York City. No one remembers it. Very few people remember it. There was a place called the New York Jazz Museum, and it was on West 55th Street between 6th and 7th from 1972 to about 1976, and then it moved to West 56th Street for another year or two. And I actually worked at as a junior high school student as a full-time weekend volunteer at the New York Jazz Museum back in the early 1970s, which no one remembers. It's not that no one remembers that I worked there, right? Nobody remembers the museum. If I've talked to, literally without exaggeration, if I've talked to 1,000 people, or more than 1,000 people over the last 3 years about this project, of the thousands, I said, yeah, thousands of people that I've spoken to, I'd say 3 or 4 say, you know, there was a jazz museum in New York, and so we're going to figure out why. Well, anyway, that's kind of indirectly why Tajah's here tonight, because a man who was a big-time volunteer jazz supporter for many years, a guy named Bert Westridge, who worked at the New York Jazz Museum, like I did, as a kind of a full-time volunteer. And this is Bert right here, who's done a lot of good things for jazz. A lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. And Bert, I was giving a talk for the Duke Ellington Society maybe a year or so ago, or more, and Bert brought his friend to the talk, and the talk was Jacquie Murdock, whose name is Tajah, who danced at the Apollo Theater and is not only a phenomenal dancer, but a historian with a wonderful collection of, I can tell you right now that there are many theater, black theater, New York, historian folks who'd be drooling if they could see the photos in her collection. And not only the photos in her collection, but the links to the history that are behind it. And she's going to be talking about all these things. So that's a long way of saying that I'd like to introduce our guest for this evening, one of the most elegant people we've had come into our orbit. Miss, I'm just making it slow because he just went together. The Jacquie Murdock. Her stage name was Tajah, and here she is. And we'll have you sit right over here. Voila. How are you? Here's your microphone.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll get going. First question first. Can I call you Tajah or Jacquie? Which do you prefer?
Tajah.
Tajah. Okay.
Which
I got you to talk to
it means fresh.
Okay.
That's what an Indian friend of mine told me.
Okay. Well, first thing I'd like to ask you, Tajah, is about Harlem, because this is the Jazz Museum in Harlem, and you know a lot more about it than I do. So tell me.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Loren, and Mr. Garment. Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Loren and Mr. Garment for this special honor. Having been born not too far from here, actually, on 129th Street and 7th Avenue, which is now called Adam Clayton Boulevard, I believe. My father owned a restaurant on 129th Street and 7th Avenue, and we had an apartment in back of the restaurant. And Harlem was a very different place at that time. Life was much more simple. I mean, we had no computers or television, refrigerators, cell phones. It was simple life.
Well, let me ask you, how did your family wind up in Harlem? How did that happen?
My parents were immigrants that came through Ellis Island from Cuba in 1920. My mother had been here before because her two aunts came in the early 1900s and opened a beauty salon at 141st and 7th Avenue. They did a lot of the women's hair from the Lafayette Theater. And she came to them, and then she left and went to Cuba to marry my father, whom she had grown up with, my father. So she went to Cuba, and then after living there for a few years, my sister was born in Santiago de Cuba. There was a revolution, and they had to get out. It was a work stoppage. It wasn't like Castro's revolution. They just told the rebels to ride their horses down and put their arms down, no killing, you know. So my father said, I gotta get out of this country, I have a wife and baby. So my mother came first, and then my father came after. It was only one passage, and it wasn't like these luxury boats, it was like a cargo boat. And they settled in Harlem.
You know, I wanted to just as we're getting to the shank of the interview, can you hear folks back there? Would it be worthwhile if we kind of moved the chairs over this way so we had more one-on-one eye contact? Because I just feel like like they're on the wrong side of the face. I think we're going to take a break for about 1 minute, and let me redo the chair. Folks want to move up front? You have to forgive me. It's the teacher in me from all those years teaching. The people in the back of the room, I always say, come on, man. Hey, how are you? How are you? Good. You made it. Thank you. See? Wow. All right. Right. So, we were talking about your family, your mother going to Cuba, your father having to leave the country. Let me have just a little bit of background I'd like to explain to everyone. We're videotaping this, and we're videotaping it for our archive. This becomes part of the archive of the Jazz Museum in Harlem. And so I'd like to get us more background. How did your mother meet your father?
They grew up together.
They grew up together in
Jamaica.
Jamaica, right, right. And the reason that your dad was in Cuba was, once again?
Well, he left.
Can you get more on the mic, because I'm not sure if they can hear you.
He left.
Can you hear?
Oh,
Okay,
yes.
okay, thanks, I'm sorry.
Is the mic on?
It's on.
You just have to be more into it.
My father left first. My father was a son of a Scottish plantation owner. And he left when he was about 19, maybe. He went on to Cuba. His father had given him work to do, but he didn't want to stay in Jamaica. So he went on to Cuba. My mother came here. And then when she wrote to him, he said, get your wedding clothes together. And her aunt accompanied her to Cuba, and they were married. They had planned this from childhood. But what I want to talk about is Harlem, because Harlem is so close to my heart. Growing up in Harlem, people worked hard. You know, this was just after the Depression times. Some people that were fortunate enough to have jobs and some didn't. And when it came to the weekend, when the eagle flew, people just wanted to party. And even though there was not much money, people didn't feel poor because they lived a rich life. Well, you'll notice that in Harlem, they have churches on practically every corner. And there's also a liquor store and a bar. And people would, when they got paid, would go out for entertainment. You know, they would go to there were different clubs, you know, and also the ballrooms, like the Audubon Ballroom where Malcolm X was assassinated, and there was the Rennie Ballroom, and there were, of course, the Savoy Ballroom, which we all know about. And you had the Baby Grand and Club Sudan and all these different clubs, so people went out to enjoy themselves. There was a large migration of people here from the South and a large migration from the Caribbean. And people would have clubs. Like you would have a group of your friends from South Carolina. So you call yourself the Mighty Jets or something, and we're gonna have a dance this weekend. And they would rent the Renaissance Ballroom, because I, as a child at the age of maybe 5 and 6, we didn't have television, but we had a big radio as big as a TV, and we would listen to Martin Block and the Make Believe Ballroom. And this was the era of the big band sound. So you heard all the big bands. You heard Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Chick Webb, and all the different music. My mother had a special rocking chair, and I used to rock for a couple of hours listening to the music and fantasizing and seeing myself dancing to this music, because I was born with a dancing spirit. My parents never danced. I never saw them dance. And I never saw them go to a dance. But people used to have what they call rent parties. When they couldn't afford to pay their rent, they would get a party going. They'd say, buy some food, and they would cook the soul food and chicken and potato salad, and people would come there. In the back room, there'd be a card game going on, and they'd be gambling back there, and in the front would be music and socializing. And you'd hear Alberta Hunter used to say, give me a pig foot and a bottle of beer.
Right.
Yeah, well, that sort of thing used to go on. But I was a child in the 1930s. I was a child. I was born in 1930.
Tajah, can I ask a question?
Please.
You mentioned churches on the corner, and you mentioned music, but you mentioned music in the context of the clubs. It's my understanding.
Yeah, but I
that-
didn't get to that
Okay.
yet, because a lot of entertainers started out in the churches. A lot of the singers, like Aretha Franklin, a lot of these people that played the organ and piano and sang in the choir in church, they started out. I didn't mention it yet, but I was going to get to it.
Right, so we will let you tell your story at your own pace. Let me ask you a question. How did, now you mentioned that you didn't see your parents dance, but nonetheless you were born with a dancing spirit. So how did music come into your life, and how did dancing actually start for you?
Well, I listened to the radio with Martin Block and yes.
But I listened to the
Make
radio too, but I didn't wind up being a dancer. And
Well,
you
I
wound
used
up
to just dance
dancing at the
around through
Apollo.
the house all the time until when I was about 5, my parents signed me up at the Harlem Y for dance lessons. And I did my first performance at the age of 5 at the Harlem Y. I remember it like it was yesterday because I had Shirley Temple curls, and a French tam and a white satin blouse and pleated blue skirt. And I tap danced to East Side, West Side, all around the town. And then the whole group did the butterfly dance, with the wings and sort of a modern dance. And at the end, we did anchors away in little white sailor suits with little white sailor cap, forming an anchor, and did a circle. So that was the first time that I really performed.
2 questions. Where was the Y?
I believe it was at 135th. I'm not sure, 137th. I was very young at the time.
And how was it that at the age of 5 years old you're tap dancing? Were there lessons, or
Well, the lady-
just a group of kids, or how
The
did that
lady
happen?
that was the teacher taught me the time step and the break. So we did this dance. That was just alone that I did that, but the other dances was with the group. And the lady promised to bring me ballet slippers, and I was just, ballet slippers. There were no black or children of color that I knew of in ballet, but that would have been just up my alley, just what I wanted. And then my parents took me out of dance class, dance school. And I was very upset. My mother said I never forgave her. And I think she was right, actually, because it's what I wanted. So I didn't have any more dance classes for quite a few years. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, they gave me classical piano lessons. And I said, well, why did they give me classical piano when they could have given me ballet and tap? But I just found it very difficult to read music. So what I used to do was memorize, because we were playing Mozart and Bach and Beethoven. And I would go on Saturday and play the piece by memory. So this teacher, Miss Margetson, she used to have her students go to Juilliard and take a test. And she enrolled me in the test. I took the test at Juilliard, and I got 90, which was pretty good, But it's not what I had wanted. Dancing was in my spirit and my blood. So when it came to the worldwide test, I said, I don't want it anymore, and stamped my foot, which I could kick myself to this day for. Because as a dancer, to know music is very helpful if you want to explain your music to the band.
Yes.
Anyway, I didn't dance for quite a few years until I reached my teenage years.
Before we get to the teenage years, I was wondering if you could tell us where exactly was it in Harlem that you were living with your family? If you kind of paint a picture of the neighborhood and the specific area and what it was like.
Yes. On 7th Avenue, we moved a lot because after my father's partner had left the business and left my father with the restaurant, and people couldn't afford to go out and eat out in those days. I mean, it was rough. And people would go to Father Divine, who had this large following at his church, and they cooked and sold a meal for a nickel, I guess. I was very young, but I assumed that's what was going on. So my father eventually had to give up the restaurant and went to work downtown in a French restaurant called Mary Elizabeth, a very well-known restaurant off of 5th Avenue and 37th Street. So we moved a lot. You could always find a sign in the window in Harlem saying vacancy. So we lived all over Harlem. We lived on Bradhurst Avenue. We lived on 7th Avenue. We lived on 113th Street, on the east side, quite a few places. But Harlem was more family-oriented. I mean, you didn't hear of the things that you hear of today. I never heard of a child being kidnapped. The only kidnapping I heard of was the Lindbergh baby. The guy that flew around the world, Lindbergh,
Right, Lindbergh's
very wealthy man, and they kidnapped his baby. But a child could be out in the street playing till 10 o'clock at night. When it got too hot, people would put a pillow on a fire escape and sleep outside. And people would put their clothesline on the roof, and my mother would hang the things up on the roof to bleach out from the sun. Nobody stole your things, you know, it was just a simple life with family. People knew each other in the neighborhood. We always knew the people that lived next door or in the neighborhood, and it was wonderful for children. So it was different, very different.
Where did you go to grammar school, Tajah?
I went to elementary school. I don't remember the first school I went to, but afterwards I went to 186. This was after when we moved up on Sugar Hill, because down here was called the Valley.
Okay.
Anywhere from Fifth Avenue up to Bradhurst Avenue was called the Valley. I mean, where do you live? Oh, I live in the Valley. But then we moved up on Sugar Hill, which Sugar Hill was like from Edgecombe Avenue to Convent to Amsterdam, Broadway, Riverside Drive. Actually, they call Riverside Drive Harlem now, but when I lived up there, it was called Washington Heights. It was not part of Harlem. And it was mostly Irish and German in my neighborhood. So we moved a lot around Harlem, but is there anything else you'd like to know about Harlem?
Well, there's a lot I'd like to know. Of course there is, but I'd like just to have you tell it at your own pace and in your own way. I don't mean to push with my questions. So where we were was, you mentioned that your folks took you out of dance school. You studied the classical piano. You got a 90 at Juilliard, but you were playing by ear.
Yes.
And you wished that you had still played the piano because you could have explained the music easier to the people in the band, which is true. You know, when dancers dance with the band, it's always good if you can tell them, you know, hit the fourth beat or something like that.
Because they can mess you up, you know.
Oh, Lord.
If they don't like you or they play the wrong music, you can really get messed up out there.
Yeah.
But
Someone told me, actually, it's funny, Tajah, we were talking, because we have the daughter of one of the great drummers here, Panama Francis's daughter here.
wonderful.
And when I worked with Panama, he told me that the great drummers, whether it was Sid Catlett or whomever, the drummers would watch the dancers dancing and kind of
And keep the
follow
beat.
it and underline, like if they went like this and they go boom or something like
Yeah,
that.
keep the beat.
And then if a drummer wanted to make trouble, they could, you know, sabotage you. Of course, the great ones never did that, but the lesser ones might have for some silly reason. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So you were a teenager, and you wanted to dance. Your
You
parents took you
asked
out
me
of
where I
dance
went
school.
to school, and I went to
I remember.
school at 186 up
Right.
on Amsterdam Avenue on 46. And then I went to Stitt on 164th Street between Amsterdam and Edgecombe. And I went to the High School of Commerce when it changed to female. It was all male boys school at one time. And that was the first year that it turned to, and, you know, for boys and girls. So that's where I went to school. And as I became a teenager, I got very bored in high school, actually. I was always dreaming about going and be another Josephine Baker and doing something like that. So I wanted to live life, not to read about it. I wanted to live it. And I convinced my parents that I was going to quit school in the 12th grade. Even though I was about an 80 student, I just wanted to do my own thing. I promised them that I would go to night school, but I really knew that I wanted to dance in clubs. Because my father was very strict. He had 3 daughters, and I was the youngest. So, I mean, we couldn't even have boy company. Not even from the church. And if you wanted to spend the night, you know, we said, oh, well, can I spend the night at my girlfriend's house? And my father said, you have your own bed. So I was brought up pretty strictly, but I was a rebel because I being the youngest one, my father was probably in his 40s when I was born, so I got away with much more than my two sisters did. One was 3 years older, and the other one that was born in Cuba was 10 years older. So I was a baby of the family, spoiled brat, daddy's little girl. So when I got to high school, well, I left high school, one of my girlfriends in high school, my best friend Vicky, lived on 122nd and St. Nicholas at that little, it turns off between 8th and St. Nicholas, going down there near Mittens Playhouse. And I had this little boyfriend who, his mother was divorced, and he lived with his mother. So one day,
Jackie, I'm sorry. I'm gonna switch mics. There's a little bit of a short in your wire that keeps making noise. I'm gonna give you mine, which doesn't have that noise in it.
can you hear me now? So one day he said to me, can you go with me? I got to check out my father to get some money for my father. So I said, sure. So he takes me down to Mittens Playhouse.
Oh, boy.
Now, I was just so fascinated. This was in the afternoon, broad daylight, and I go in there. He had a very handsome father, a woman with a mink coat or whatever, fur coat down to her ankles, and the music was playing. I said, all of this is happening in the daytime? Wow, this was exciting to me,
Right.
And my boyfriend always hung out in Mittens, so I used to be a regular. I mean, the bartenders knew me, everybody knew me in Mittens, because I'd see Dizzy, he was just starting out with bebop. They were all young, starting out to revolutionize the music. And a lot of times they came and sat in. They had this picture on the wall in Mittens Playhouse. It was a musician with a horn and a woman on a chase lounge. It was just,
It's still there.
yeah, I often think about that mural on the wall in Mittens Playhouse. But while I was still in high school, I met a friend of mine who was a dancer named Norton Stoney. Stoney had studied tap dance at Mary Bruce, who was about the only dance teacher in Harlem at that time. And she had a studio on 125th Street on St. Nicholas Avenue up on the second floor. And Stoney was an excellent dancer and contortionist. And Stoney would have all the pretty girls around him because he was very talented and he would teach girls how to dance. So Vicky and I, she took me up there and he said, "Do you like to dance?" I said, "I love to dance." And he said, I was a bit bashful, He said, "Can you do this? Can you do this?" And I was doing it. So we started rehearsing in his mother's living room. And he would also make costumes on his mother's sewing machine. And Vicky, he and I, when these people would have a dance at these ballrooms,
Sure.
they would hire us. We were known as the Afro-Cuban dancers. And we would work every weekend, either at the Audubon, or the Rennie, or the Savoy, or any place else that we could get a gig.
Right.
Because Stoney taught me, he said, now, remember, as long as you have a gig, that's what counts in show business, as long as you're working. And Stoney and I, sometimes it was a whole group of us
Excuse me.
that would dance. It's like Billy Dodson and Leona Laviscon. I think her father was a doctor and her aunt brought her up and she was an excellent dancer. So she would sometimes partner with Billy Dodson or with Stoney. But we would switch around partners, But it was an exciting time because we were very young. We were still teenagers, 16, 17 years old. And it was fun. And we'd get paid for it. And we would take our friends and they would throw out some change. And then everybody started throwing quarters, nickels, and dimes. And then we go backstage and divvy it up. So this was a lot of fun for us.
What was, just for folks who may not know, what's a contortionist?
Contortionist is a person that did acrobatics and those all kinds of acrobatics, could bend their body in different positions and do different things. I remember one time there was a dance hall up on 145th in Amsterdam upstairs, a very large place, and there was a dance, and Stoney wanted me to use fire, and I said, I really don't think so. I don't want to do it, but he said, don't worry, look at this. And he poured some alcohol on cotton, put it in his hand, and it just sat there, and it didn't burn him. So he said, while we're dancing, I want you to put this on me. And it was his mother's club. So we're dancing, and the man that was in charge put the stick with the alcohol, with the cotton in the alcohol, which saturated it.
Oh, Lord.
So that when I did like that, he was making leaps that I never saw before. And I said, you know, this is not part of the act. And twirls and leaps and everything. And then when I got backstage, he was almost burned. His mother said, oh, you tried to burn my baby. And I said, I'm sorry, Miss Stoney, but he told me to do it. You know, I didn't want it to work with fire. But these were learning lessons. He would always call me and say, we have a job, we have a gig. We did one of the first rock and roll shows.
I just want to take it back from me because you mentioned that you were going out for some of the with the Afro-Cuban dancers and doing these gigs at all these great ballrooms. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more technically for a moment for the archives and for our audience. How did you work your routines out? Because that's a mystery to most people when they see the dancers dancing to the band. I think they just assume that they're just dancing, it's just kind of natural. They don't know all the work that went into it and all the routine.
Stoney would have us up at his house. Like he would call me up and say, come up my house. And he would choreograph the dance.
I'm going to ask you to define it. What does choreograph a dance mean? And how did you actually come up with it? And how did you rehearse? And how did you work on it? And did he let you have ideas, or did he say how it went? And how
Well,
did you
he planned it most of the times. And he would teach me because, like, I didn't have the background. I wasn't fortunate enough to have had that background of dance. So he would say, twirl and leap. And I said, I can't do that. Yes, you can. You can do it. Try it. You know, and we'd do it over and over again until he would just plan the whole routine.
Who were some of the other dance teams at that time that you and Stoney either respected, admired, modeled yourselves after?
Of course, Bill Robinson was the best dancer, tap dancer actually. And there was so many Bunny Briggs. There was
were you
the Nicholas brothers, but they went on to Europe.
Were you doing those kind of routines that they did,
No,
or was it more ballroom
we
dancing?
did more ballroom and sort of African and Cuban mixed dance.
Tell us about the African-Cuban mix. I'm very interested in that. What does that mean? What was it?
A lot of drums, as you mentioned before, and it's hard to describe it actually. You know, some sort of South American music. It's just put together. It's just hard to say, you know, because my parents did come from Cuba and they lived up in the mountains where they had the real Afro-Cuban music, you know, so this just came naturally to me. And also, this was the time that the Palladium had opened up. And Machito and Graciela, also all the other bands, Tito Rodriguez, Tito Puente. We would go down there every Wednesday night. All the movie stars, Marlon Brando, he would be there. He was skinny then. Very handsome guy. And Arthur Murray and his wife had a ballroom dance school. And they were the judges, and they looked like fish out of water because they were such refined people. And they were the judges. And they would have these couples come out with costumes, sort of Roomba costumes, elegant guys and girls. And one girl had a little sister about 5 years old. They made her a little costume too. And they would come out and we would dance all night long. And this is how we learned how to do the mambo, the pachanga, the charanga, and all the different dances, the merengue, you know, and it was just a great time. I'm glad I was born during that era because there was so many different things happening at that time, you know, so. As I was saying, we did one of the first rock and roll shows with, I think it was Sonny Till and the Orioles. Stoney called me as usual and said, we have a gig, we're going up to Waterbury, Connecticut. They're having one of the first rock and roll shows. So I said, rock and roll? What is that, you know? He said, well, we're doing Afro-Cuban dance, so don't worry about it. So we went up to Waterbury, and these were mainly kids from rich families. They all came out to see the show. There was one young Italian boy that came with his parents that was a singer. And I'm sure, I don't know which singer, whether it was Barbie Darren. I know that boy became famous. But he was young, so his parents accompanied him. And the show was such a success that they did a second show. And they had to put out the wooden barriers, and all the kids went home and changed clothes and came back in the evening, afternoon. And so after the show was over, people were jumping into cars, and Stoney said, jump in the car, quick. I said, why? He said, just get in. And about 7 cars was speeding down the road, and I said, what's going on? Well, the guy made so much money that he left with the money that booked us up there. And he had to practically run him down on somebody's lawn. And we got our money and got paid. But these were the experiences in show business that you can go through. You could be working in a beautiful place one week, and the next week it could be not so beautiful place. Anyway, that's how I started, but I always studied. I remember when Jeffrey Holder first came here, he was teaching at the Henry Street Settlement, and I studied with him. He did an East Indian dance called Dougla, and I studied with Mary Anthony at NYU. I studied with a Russian ballet teacher for 2.5 years. Alexander Markov was principal dancer in La Scala in Italy when he was young. But when I met him, he was a much older man, and he had a studio on 72nd Street between West End Avenue and Broadway. But I always studied, and I always took legitimate jobs in between. Because what I found out about dancer's life and show business was that the jobs were few and far between. And I like to have money. So I always, even in high school, I think I started working when I was about 13. I took jobs in the summer when school was out. And I also worked in the White Tower in the neighborhood on Broadway on 47th Street in the summers. I managed a ladies' boutique. I did a lot of different things because to me it was experience and it was fun. I worked in a factory. I worked at jobs that I knew that I never would want to do for a living. By doing it, I learned that I don't want to do this for a living. I don't want to do that for a living. And when I told my father I wanted to be a dancer, that was out of the question. Be a secretary. And at that time, there were no young women of color in offices at that time. There were no black nurses or doctors at Harlem Hospital. It was Adam Clayton Powell that stood on a soapbox on 135th in Lenox, and they had no black sales girls on 125th Street either. Because I worked there once in Bloomstein's department store one summer. I think it was Easter, selling hats. Because I always found it to be fun to learn about different things. So after Stoney joined Norma Miller's dance troupe, her troupe was already set. She had girls like, remember Priscilla, Barbara, and I can't remember all of them, but Stoney joined. And sometimes he worked with different people because there was a dancer, a very beautiful Tandalea. You remember Tandalea? She was gorgeous. And he went, I think, to work with her. She wanted to use two young, elegant black guys in her act. And I think it was the name of the club. I forget the name, I forget the name of the club, but he went to work with her. But then he joined Norma Miller's dance troupe. And Norma was going into the Apollo, and she wanted tall girls to go in. And that was my opportunity. Now, this was like a dream come true, because from the age of 5 and 6, we used to go to the Apollo and see all the top acts. You could see the best comedians, the best dancers, tap dancers, the best musicians, the best singers, Billy Eckstein, Sarah Vaughan, all of these people. I mean, the line would be all the way down the block on Fridays and Saturdays nights to go to the Apollo. And that was like the epitome. People would come from different cities just to work at the Apollo. And the owner was named Frank Schiffman. So when I had that opportunity, I was so excited. And I was accepted by Norma Miller to go into the Apollo with the Count Basie show.
Oh, Lord.
This was so wonderful. And I think it was the night before the show opened, Mr. Schiffman, Frank Schiffman, came over to me and he said, do you know how to recite the Constitution to the United States? I said, you don't want me to recite that to that audience, do you? And he laughed and he said, no, you're going to be in a skit with Pygmy. I had never acted in my life. I was scared to death. And that's when I learned that Pygmy wrote his own material. And he ran it down to me like, yes, and then I do this and I do that, and then you come in and then you say, hello, darling, am I late? And I was like, yes, sir, yes, sir. You know, I'm about 17 or 18 years old. And I was really nervous about it. And it came on right after our dance number. I had to run upstairs, change into a dress, run back down on stage and say, hello, darling, am I late? And most of the time I was late. It was really, but it was quite an experience to stand behind those curtains. And when that Count Basie band struck up, you could get the vibrations from the floor coming up to your feet, all the way up to the top of your head. It was just wonderful. I often wondered what happened to, he had a daughter.
Yes.
She was in a wheelchair, and his wife used to bring her backstage all the time. You know, he loved children. Because if you remember the photo they have of the greatest day in Harlem, you'll see him sitting on the curb with all the children of the neighborhood when that was taken, you know. But I often wondered what happened with her. You know, she was about 5 years old at the time. Well, that had to be around 1948. So after that, Norma went to Europe, and I think she went to Colombia, South America, and the troupe left. So I decided, well, I have to get out here on my own. So I made up a little routine. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I started working. They had a booking agent on 125th Street called Fritz Pollard. Fritz Pollard was a former football hero. And Vicki and I used to go up to his office all the time, and the chorus girls used to be up there practicing. These were old girls to us because they were like 21, 22 years old. We were still in high school. So these girls would teach us to tap, to do tap dance, and gave me shoes. They didn't charge you anything. They just gave me these silver tap shoes, and we'd hang out up there, you know, a lot. So I would get booked in clubs. I remember he booked me in, I think it was Philadelphia. And I had this routine I made up. And when I came back in the dressing room, the girl said, how old are you? I said I was about 17 or 18. And they said, we thought so.
Right.
Because I would go to the hotel and lock myself in my room. I wasn't hanging out. I was in a strange city, and I didn't know what might happen, you know. So the guy would knock on the door and say, oh, we're having a card game down the hall. We're inviting you to come. And I said, I don't play cards, which was the truth. Up to this day, I don't play cards. And the next morning at breakfast, he said, oh, the guys were betting that I could get you to come out your room. But I didn't come out, because that's the way it was. So I was out there for about 2 or 3 years. And I said, this is not working. You know, there's not enough work for dancers. I didn't see anything happening. And I was walking down 34th Street, and I saw a sign up there that said, agency, you know. So I went up, and I told him, man, I'm looking for a job. And he said, well, I guarantee, can you type? And I said, yes, I won a prize for fast typing in junior high school. So he said, well, I'm going to guarantee that I'm going to send you someplace, but I think they will hire you. Because, you know, as a child, people used to say, where are you from? They always thought I was foreign. And I'd say, Harlem, you know. I was proud to say Harlem, you know. I lived in this exciting place called Harlem. So he looked at me, he said, yeah, I think they'll hire you. But if they don't, I promise you I'll get you a job. So he sends me over, and you know where he sent me to? Universal Motion Pictures.
Oh.
Distributors on 9th Avenue and 43rd Street, 650 9th Avenue. So I get there, and everybody's whispering and looking, and the man said to me, can you type? I said, yes, I can. And these days, they didn't have electric typewriters. They were these hard things. And I typed, and he said, when can you start? And I said, I could start right now. So he said, you're hired. So everybody came, do you want to go to lunch? And I said, oh, no, I'm sorry, I have an appointment. I didn't have an appointment. I went out to 42nd Street to a restaurant called Sardi's. It was an Italian restaurant, not the Sardi's, but it was right on the corner of 42nd, and they had the real pizza and the real pasta fazool and stuff. And I would go there. So I made very good friends with the girls at work. 2 of the girls lived in Hell's Kitchen. They were Greek, and their uncle owned a restaurant on 145th and Broadway called Le Petit Paris. And they had waiters with cummerbunds. And they told me, they said, everybody was whispering, a black girl's coming, a black girl's coming. You know, and it was just odd that I was the first black girl to work at Universal Motion Pictures. But my heart was still with show business. And I had caught the bug by then. But I worked there for a year. I worked there until I had my daughter. And they wanted me to come back when she was 2 months old. I told them I can't come back now, but I told Mr. Simon, I said, whenever, you know, I want to come back. He said, anytime, because I was a good worker. So I went back to work there after I had my daughter, and then 1955 came. And I had made friends with Herbie Harper. Herbie Harper there was a club in Atlantic City called Club Harlem, and they had used chorus girls there. Rose Hardaway was one of the dancers, and he had taken her out of the chorus and given her this jungle dance to do, and took it to Europe. It was called Jazz Train.
Ah, okay.
And they went to Europe with it, and she did this dance. In fact, when Norma Miller's show went into the Apollo, Rose Hardaway was principal dancer there. She did this dance that Herbie Harper had choreographed for her. Anyway, Herbie was telling me that they were going to do a revival of Jazz Train and take it back to Europe if I was interested. And I said, yes. But at the same time, Irving C. Miller and Florine Miller were doing a revival of the Brown Skin Models. Brown Skin Models was a traveling show that Irving C. Miller and Florney Miller put on, the first black musical on Broadway called Shuffle Along. And he patterned the brown skin models off of the Ziegfeld models, which were white models, and dancers, showgirls. And he wanted to show that they were beautiful women of color also. And that's why they made the brown skin models, and they would travel all through the South, which was called the Chitlin Circuit.
As we continue with Tajah, Tajah was mentioning Florida Miller and Irving Miller, the folks who were along with U.B. Blake and Noble Sissel, who did that first black show on Broadway back in the 1920s called Shuffle Along. So when we talk with Tajah, and I haven't even asked you how you got the name Tajah yet, which is we're talking about someone whose personal history intersects with the actual foundation of this legendary dance world. And we're so honored to have you here and telling your story for this audience. It's just it's almost overwhelming. But before we get back to the European tour, and I'm dying to find out whether you went with Jazz Train or whether you stayed on this thing, how did the name Tajah happen? Or does that come later in the story?
That comes a little later.
All right, I'll wait then. I'll wait. I'll be good. I'll be good. Okay, so let's pick it up where we left off. So you have this choice.
Yes. So I agreed with Herbie that I would join the Jazz Train and do this jungle dance that Rose Hardaway had done. And then he called me and told me that he was going to choreograph for the Brown Skin Models, that the other job was on hold. They couldn't find the backers. If I preferred to come in, and audition for the Brown Skin Models, which I did, and I was accepted by Irving C. Miller and his wife, who had been one of the original brown skin models in the 1920s. Actually, I have a picture there of the brown skin models that you could show. Where's somebody?
Wilhelmina, do you know the pictures? We kind of rehearse it. Here it is. I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll kind of walk it around.
Yeah, there's a picture there of the original brown skin models. That was probably in the 1920s and the 1930s. They would travel all through the South, putting on shows. So they decided to do a revival and open up at the Apollo Theater and go on to Washington, D.C. at the Howard Theater. So that was, U.B. Blake was starring in the show.
Oh, wow.
Leslie Uggams was a little girl with great big ribbon bows, a child. And Mantan Moreland, who played in all the Charlie Chan movies,
Sure.
he was in the show. But one thing that I had noticed, from a very early start in this business was that people seemed to be struggling for so long and didn't quite get the backing that they should. And I knew that Harlem was full of culture, art, music, but they never made the money or never got the recognition. And when some of them were never heard of, or, and I believe in history. I love history because it has a lot to do with the present and the future. And just like this person right here, yes, I couldn't remember this.
Lester Jenkins played at Savoy with Cootie Williams Band.
You see, and
Mr. Jenkins played drums with Cootie Williams' band at the Savoy.
at the Savoy Ballroom.
Actually, I just wanted just to interrupt for one moment because, again, the names that she's mentioning in passing, you did a comedy routine with Pigmeat Markham. Pigmeat
Yes.
Markham, my heavens. And it's so funny because you talk about people not getting credit for things.
Right.
When I was growing up, everybody thought that Sammy Davis Jr. invented the "Here Comes the Judge, Here Comes the Judge," and later on, they all told me it was Big Meat Markham.
That wrote, I told you,
And
he wrote
everybody
his
thought
own
that Sammy
material.
Davis Jr. had made this thing up, and he just took it lock, stock, and barrel right from.
They
from
used to
Big Meat.
have a comedy team, Apis and
That's the leader.
Estrelina,
That's the leader.
used to be at the Apollo all the time. Honey Cole, I have pictures of Honey Cole over there when he was working through William Morris Agency, but he was young and struggling with a wife and child.
Sure.
And after Frank Schiffman passed away, his son took over the theater, and Honey Cole managed the Apollo for a while. Even though he was a great tap dancer, he had to have a living to support his family, you know, and this was rough because there were not enough jobs out there, not enough work. And that's when I get on to the jazz era of Mitten's Playhouse and seeing Dizzy. Hi, you know, you just see these people in the street. Billy Eckstein, I'd see him on 123rd Street and 7th Avenue. He used to hang out by Ray Robinson's bar and barbershop. Ray Robinson owned that whole block, and his wife had a boutique. They had a bar, a barbershop, and a boutique. And he'd have this purple Cadillac parked out there. He was the only one that had a car that color. And he and Billy Eckstein would be standing out there dressed up in these vicuna coats, and very handsome guys, you know. They used to wear the hats with the brim and suits. They were sharp guys, you know. And you just see these people that you read about and hear about now. And there was a bar on 126 and 8th Avenue down from backstage from the Apollo where a lot of the entertainers used to go after the show. Stop in there and meet, you know.
What was the name of it?
A Braddock bar. A lot of people used to hang there. But my favorite was Mitten's Playhouse because I loved live music. I remember when I lived on Riverside Drive when I was married, Candy Finch, that was the drummer for Dizzy, and his wife, Candy was from out of Detroit, and his wife was a former dancer, and we were friends, you know, so one night she said, "Oh, come on down, Milt Jackson and Candy are doing a set," even though they had worked with Dizzy, they might have been off that night, so they were going to do their own set at Mitten's, you know, and people would come and sit in and play, and it was just exciting times,
I
really.
have a question. Did people dance in Mitten's Playhouse to the music, or they just sit and
Not
listen?
so much dancing at Mitten's Playhouse, no. They just drank, listened to the music,
Right.
you know, and that was it. A lot of downtown women were up there, because they, like, you would see. I went to see a wonderful play last Saturday about Thelonious Monk, or Monk, and I was literally sitting at the edge of my seat because I was almost living Mitten's, you know, when he talked about the frustration. It wasn't only like about Thelonious Monk, but it was portraying a lot of jazz musicians that were trying to revolutionize the music and couldn't be accepted, and the frustration and the anger, and a lot of them went on to drugs and alcohol. And it was sad, you know, because a lot of them were very talented, creative. And creative people are difficult anyway, because they don't want to be put in a box. You know, you can't put us in a box. We have to experiment. And they were looking to reach a different sound, and they had, like in Thelonious Monk, when he said a different language. The first time when I was a teenager and I heard two grown men say, "Hi, baby," and I said, two grown men calling each other baby. And come over to my crib. Crib? Baby, a crib? What is this talk? You know, but this was the hip talk of, you know, that era, you know. So it was quite an exciting time. Now we got on to, after this show was at the Apollo
Right.
of the brown skin models.
What was Mantan Moreland like?
Mantan Moreland did a comedy act there, but he also was struggling. U.B. Blake was struggling financially. These people, with all the Charlie Chan movies that I saw him in, I figured this guy is rich. but it wasn't so, you know? And, well, Leslie Uggams was a child, and her mother traveled with her everywhere. But it was sort of heartbreaking. But Ed Sullivan came up to see the show and gave it a wonderful write-up. And Robert Sylvester and said the show should make Broadway. So a meeting was called with the union, and we were all hepped up about it to come downtown. I don't remember whether it was the Paramount Building, and that this show might go on Broadway. And we were very excited. I think I ran into Mercer Ellington in the hallway there, and Joe Louis was there, and the backers were there, and they liked it, but not enough to put the money behind it. So that was that, right there. And that's the way it was with a lot of things in those days. And you know, these people, Irving C. Miller and Claudie Miller, were in Hollywood at one time. I never knew that Joe Louis was part of show business. That I think he was the one that got Rochester into show business through Claudie Miller. And so that was the end of that. I was not interested in going back to work, but I went down to my old job at Universal with my daughter was about 3 years old to visit my Greek girlfriends, and the boss says, "You still belong to the union. Go over down the block and speak to the guy." And he hired me at RKO in the same building. I wasn't even looking for a job. So I went to work there. I always had jobs in between because I didn't go to Europe, but while we were rehearsing for Brown Skin Models, they got the backers for Jazz Train, and Herbie said you could either go with us or stay with this show, and I said I prefer to stay with this show. And they went on to Europe, and I heard somehow a lot of them got stranded over there. Unfortunately, I never heard from Herbie after that, but Stoney, he left Norma by that time and decided to live in Milan. He learned to speak fluent Italian and settled in Iran speaking Farsi. He said he was their black saint. He only came back to the States a few times, but every time he came, his mother would call me. The whole building would turn out when Stoney came back from Europe. He was in Cleopatra, in the movie Cleopatra. He was in a lot of movies over there with Fellini. Yeah, he was in quite a few. I'm sorry, I thought I brought the picture of him with this beautiful blonde in Paris. He was modeling in a white suit. I had the picture. I don't know why it's not in that group of pictures, but I did have it to bring to show. And he stayed over there until the Ayatollah came back, and they burned down the whole place. They burned down all the cigarette places and all the American nightclubs. And he had to get out. He got out on one of the last planes to Germany, and by way of Germany back to New York. He was a stranger in his own country. He didn't know this place because it had changed so much from the time when we were teenagers. You know, he was a total stranger here. I remember we went on a Circle Line boat ride one day, and he was speaking to these people, and I said, "Is that Italian?" He said, "No." They were people who escaped from Iran, and they were speaking in Farsi, and he spoke. I don't know whether you were there at the Village Gate when they did a celebration of the Savoy Ballroom quite a few years ago. And Stoney went and got Mary Bruce because they were putting her out of her studio because she was old by that time. And he brought her down there, and they made it like a tribute to Mary Bruce. Tondaleo was there, Honey Cole. I had drinks with him upstairs at the bar. And when it was over, Stoney told me he went around the corner because he was hungry, and they had closed the restaurant. And he spoke in Italian. The man opened up the restaurant for him and wanted to learn all about Milan or wherever in Italy. And he was telling him of where he was born, actually. You know, so they opened up the restaurant. But
I'll make it a point next time I want to lose weight not to learn Italian.
But anyway, even after that, I continued, as I told you, taking classes with a Russian ballet teacher. Mr. Demarkov wanted me to do strict ballet. And I said, Mr. Demarkov, I'm too old for strict. I was 28 years old at the time. And the only ballet dances I really knew was Dance Theater of Harlem, what's his name? I grew up across the street.
Arthur Mitchell?
I grew up across the street from Arthur Mitchell. I used to envy, he was always away from home with the ballet, but I knew his whole family, his mother, his father, sisters and brothers, and he would come in to town once in a while, very good to his mother. And I said, wow, this guy, you know, he was the only black in the ballet. And also Carmen de Lavalade, who married, I have a picture there of Jeffrey Holder and Carmen de Lavalade when they got engaged. And her sister, Maria Torchi, no, that was her cousin, Maria Torchi.
Oh, Maria Torchi.
But anyway,
How did the name Tajah come about? I'm curious.
this is what I'm getting to now.
I should have known.
After I studied with Mr. Demarkov, I said, give me a routine I could work with, Mr. Demarkov. So he gave me a routine and we tried it out at the Ansonia Hotel, and it went well. So I looked in the book for an agent, and I said, eeny, meeny, miny, and I picked Mo. I went to this agent and I auditioned, and he said, it's a very nice routine, but it's not authentic. So I said, what do you mean? Not knowing that he was the top agent for all the Middle Eastern belly dancers at the round table. So he said, do you have some time? I said, sure. He said, we're opening up a school around the corner from the Americana Hotel called Stairway to Stardom. And if you have time, we'll walk around. I said, surely. So we walked around to the Americana Hotel around down the block, and they were still nailing in the floors and putting up the mirrors. And he said, we're going to have a big party, and you're invited, and I want you to come and check it out. So, which my husband didn't, he wasn't interested, he didn't want to go. So his friend, Spanish friend called Ralph, said he would like to go. So I said, come on, you can escort me to this party. So when we got there, Art Delugov was there because he had a Middle Eastern band at the gate. And it was so exciting, the dancers, I think it was Morocco was dancing, and the drummers, and the music, you know, and we just had a great time. And Little Egypt was the first Middle Eastern dancer in this country. It was in a Broadway musical, and she fell for this guy that was with me. And he was telling them his name was Raul, and family was from Spain, probably from Puerto Rico. And I was so excited about this dance school that was opening up for these dancers that I showed up for a class, and nobody else showed up. So I had a private lesson with Serena.
Oh, Serena.
Yeah, Serena didn't own the school then. The school was owned by a tall, 6 foot tall, brassy blonde. And she had been a former stripper, and her husband was a photographer, and her name was Dolores Devine. They owned the school. So I took my 10 lessons, and I'm ready to go to work. And yet still Joe Williams would not book me. And I saw him, by that time the school got very popular. They couldn't have enough girls coming there to learn this dance. But being that I had previous experience dancing, I picked it up very fast. And I loved the music, especially the Arabic type music. So I kept saying to Dolores, why isn't he booking? He's booking this girl, and she can't even dance, actually. At the time, I was working for lawyers, mortgage and title. I would draw up like 6, 7 mortgage papers a day. And they would have me train a girl, a white girl, and then they would take her and put her up front. So when it came to vacation time, they told me I was into new construction in Rahway, and over there in Jersey was all woods. And I dealt directly with these guys that were head of construction corporations. And they were nice guys. They'd come sit in a box, waiting for the papers, you know, talk to me and stuff like that. And when it came time, they told me, well, you're gonna have to do both new construction and resales. And I said, no, this is not right. I was just doing one thing, and they had just redecorated the place with new drapes, new everything. And they said, take it or leave it. I said, I leave it. And that night I cried. My husband said, don't cry. I said, I put a few years into this job, and it's not fair, you know. So I went to Dolores Duvon. I said, look, Dolores, I've been studying with this ballet teacher for 2.5 years. I know what I'm doing. She said, I'm taking you down to Joe Williams' office. She said, so he said, well, what are we going to say you are when I send you to a club? So I said, I'm not going to say I'm anything. I'm a dance, and if they like me, they hire me. So he said, well, we'll name you Taj Mahal, like the Taj Mahal. These were the Greek clubs. This was in the 60s now. We had all of 28th, 29th, and 30th Street was all Greek. And the owner of this club had mixed musicians. They were Greek, Turkish, Arabic, mostly Turkish and Greek. He was Greek. And all the clubs, it was the craze at that time. So I went down there to audition, and I saw one of the girls. She was a blonde, but she had on a black wig, and her name was Janice, and she took the name Jezebel. And she was dancing. I said, Janice, they're not even doing half the stuff we learned. What is this? She said, oh, you learn as you go along. Just do, you know, get up there and dance. And I was hired that night. And I think we would work 21 days without a day off. But we loved it. And I was learning, because there were certain dances and certain chants that you are not supposed to get up and dance to. And they had what they call the shifter tully and Kash Lamar steps. And the old man that would do the high chants on the instruments. And he would say, get up, and the Turkish guy's name was Lufti Goneri. He was very famous over in Turkey. I met some Turkish people. I said, good. He was a movie star over in Turkey. And they would play the bouzouki and the different instruments, and we would sit up there, and I'd play the doumbeke drum. And then in between shows, you know, and then there would be at least 3 or 4 dances. And we would alternate. You know, one girl go backstage, put on a costume, come out and dance. Then another girl come out and dance. But I loved it, you know, and I quit that job Friday, and I started Monday night making twice the salary that I was making working at Lawyers. So I just had to dance.
Yeah.
And that's why I say I had a dancing spirit. So.
I was wondering if you could tell the story of this marvelous collection when you first came to visit here after I met you at the Duke Ellington Society, and you came in one day. Tajah came in with a folder, a big, huge folder full of photographs, and I didn't know what to expect. And I found out since then that what you have in this folder, and you've been kind enough to share tonight, and after the talk is over, I hope you'll all come up and look at this, but we're actually going to show some of it and talk about some of it, is a treasure trove of extraordinarily rare and important facets of entertainment history that you have here.
And some of them are signed too, like Duke Ellington's signature, and quite a few.
How did this happen? Could you tell the story of how you met this?
I'm not going to say how I acquired it, because, well, maybe I should.
Don't. I mean,
you see, I had a friend,
It's up to you.
that was much older than I,
Right.
who was a former Cotton Club dancer. And she was also a booking agent in Ed Sullivan Building for decades. Some people say she was a madam, I don't know. I never worked through her, but we were friends because she lived on Riverside Drive near me, and I knew her from I was in my 20s. And that's how I acquired this collection.
Okay.
She passed away maybe close to 100 years old. She was married to a lord, English lord, and her name was Lady Stewart. Lady Stewart had a son. She said she had been married before. I don't know if it's true or not, but Symphony said, if you know, he was one of the first Latin disc jockeys, Latin jazz. And her son is by
Symphony Six.
Symphony Sid's son.
Just the thought of someone who was married to an English lord having a kid with Symphony
No, but
Sid,
this
that's
was-
a crossing of
She
worlds.
married, no, she had the son before she married the Lord.
Okay, but still, that's a great crossing of two different worlds, because
So
Symphony
that's
Sid
why
was
they
a
called her
love
Lady. Yeah,
This is fascinating.
yeah.
You know,
So
yeah.
I was always interested in history and all of these wonderful artists, creative performers that never were recognized. People never even knew who they were. And they came from all different places to New York, to be at the Apollo, to appear here at the Baby Glen and Small's Paradise. That was just wonderful, the nights of going there, and it would be packed. And when my marriage dissolved, after I had my son, one night I went down to Smalls and there was nobody in there. And I said, wow, times had changed. And what had changed Harlem was drugs. That's what changed Harlem. And especially when Martin Luther King was assassinated, they rioted, and it was just, everything went downhill after that, unfortunately. And that's why I'm so happy to see that there's a lot of activity on 125th Street now, because it was so dead for so long. The only thing I don't agree with is that the rents are so high that ordinary people can't afford to live here anymore. You know, a lot of the brownstones. Oh, I forgot to tell you, when I was a child, to show you the culture that they had in Harlem. My mother and father always took me to classical things at Lewiston Stadium. We went over there where Aaron Davis Hall is built. When I went there the last week before, I made a mistake to step down on this high concrete thing. And one of the guys that worked there came and helped me, and I jumped down. And I said, oh my God, I'm in Lewiston Stadium. Because my mother took me there. It was built like a Greek amphitheater. And they used to put on free classical musicals and big bands, swing bands, and it was free under the stars. And you'd bring a pillow at night and sit out there in the summer and hear the most beautiful music. You know, and all of these things are past now, you know.
You mentioned something before, I'm sorry, I didn't just...
They used to also have teas, which they're getting into, I hear, in New York City again. My mother used to take me on Sundays after church. They would have these brownstones on the second floor was called the parlor floor. And they would have these teas. And you would hear poetry reading. A lot of young poets and people that were writers would read their poetry. They would have a singer. They might have a classical pianist. Or they would have somebody on an instrument, or a bass. And they would also sometimes have a tea leaf reader that would read the tea leaves, tell your fortune. And it was quite, you know, cultural. These are things that went on in Harlem in 1930s and 40s. But nobody ever associated it because they often think of just the Cotton Club and Cafe Society coming up to Harlem, and they didn't have black patrons. They only had black entertainers. And I spoke to Barney Jacobson, who owned the cookery down in the village on 8th Street before he passed away. And he said the reason why he opened up Cafe Society is because he said, if I ever own a club, I'm going to make sure I own a club that can have black patrons and customers. And Adam Clayton Powell, and when he married, what's his name? Hazel Scott had their wedding reception at Barney Jacobson's club. He was a nice man. He died almost at the age of 100 also. But these are the things that people don't know about Harlem. So,
You mentioned Small's Paradise before, and we had Alvin Reed here back in the early part of our series. Alvin Reed owns the Lenox Lounge. And we're talking about how great his club was, and he was saying, I love the Lenox Lounge, I own it, he says, but Small's Paradise was the club that,
Yes,
that
I
always
worked there
wanted.
also.
Could you do us a, could you?
What happened after the show closed with Brown Skin Models, some of us that were dancers in the show got together and did a New Year's Eve thing there, which we had top hats and these tights, and we did Daddy, I Want a Diamond Ring, bracelets, everything, you know. We did a whole routine there.
Could
at
you paint a
Smalls.
picture for those of us who weren't there? Where was Small's Paradise, and what was it like, and what was so attractive about it?
Smalls Paradise was located on 135th Street and 7th Avenue. It had a big circular bar as you entered. There would be music and jazz played upstairs, and downstairs also was a club. So there were two parts to Smalls Paradise. And all the top musicians played. I don't know if you ever played Smalls Paradise, but everyone wanted to play at Smalls. And it was always like knee-deep to the bar. You know, you just couldn't get in there because it wasn't that big a place. Downstairs was large, but upstairs it would be packed. You know, it's just it's hard to describe, you know, after living in it so many years ago. You know.
What I'd like to do is go through this wonderful collection of photos that you brought with you here today.
Oh, I definitely
about-
have to talk about
talk about
Dora
some-
Dean.
Okay, so I'm going to show this picture.
Dora Dean, when I was chosen
Is that the
to
Xerox?
portray
Tajah?
some,
Is this it? Is this
yes, and also the one of her alone, both of those,
This?
yes. Irving C. Miller and Florrie Miller picked me to portray Dora Dean.
This is going back to the 20th century.
I wanted to be Josephine Baker. I was like, oh, shucks, why did they pick me? But now I know why. And Dora Dean was from 1890.
Oh, wow.
Johnson and Dean had a team from 1890 that traveled to Tunisia and Germany. And I didn't know they had black entertainers over there at that time, you know? And a portrait artist did a life-size painting of her and had it hanging in the gallery in Paris. And I didn't even know who Dora Dean was until I saw those pictures. And I said, oh my goodness, you know? And it was an honor that I portrayed Dora Dean. And I sort of resemble her, I think, when I was younger. That's why they picked me to play Dora Dean. That's about it. Now, the others, you have the Cotton Club. What happened in Harlem, you know, Bugsy Siegel had owned the Cotton Club. And there was some big shootout with these gangsters up in Harlem in 1935, 36. And those people from Cafe Society got a little nervous about coming up to Harlem. So what they did was they had to close the Cotton Club. And they opened it in 1936 down where the Latin Quarter used to be, where Barbara Walters' father, Lou Walters, owned the Latin Quarter. Well, that's where they opened up with Duke Ellington's band. And the pictures are over there. When they opened up, I have the playbill, which was 25 cents to get it. And the pictures, if somebody could show them when they opened up in 1936 with Duke Ellington. And then Duke Ellington had something else to do, so they brought in Cab Calloway. And that was 1936. That's Ivy Anderson. But if you pick up the picture of Duke Ellington, and this is when they opened up at the Cotton Club, the downtown Cotton Club, 1936.
And you'll all be able to come up later and look at the table. We'll see them all then. Yeah. That's wonderful.
But many of the artists did not make a name for themselves, like Louis Armstrong, I have his picture there, and Duke Ellington, and Lucky Melinda, and certain people, you know, that, but others did not get any
You
recognition.
mean like Stump and Stumpy and
Oh,
Chuck
yeah.
and Chuckles and
Yeah.
all those great acts.
And I have pictures of Nicholas Brothers where Fayard looks like a little boy compared to his brother because there was a couple of years difference in age between them, you know. So I really had wanted to do a book. I'm in the process of writing a book about my life.
Oh.
I was under Joey Reynolds' WOR on New Year's Eve, and he said to me, you know, you ought to write a book. And I said, I'm already started. So he said, you finish it, I'll get you a publisher. So I'm going to take him up on it when I finish this book.
Well, well, this has been the first one. What I'd like to do is I'd like to open it up to questions and/or statements or anything, because we have a wonderful audience here tonight with all kinds of fascinating folk. So, and would like to say anything, please? This is your time. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, I want to know, what was street life like in Harlem?
I can't hear him.
I'm going to repeat the question for the mic. He said, "What was street life like?"
Street life like in Harlem? You know, what was
Well, it depends. Now, they did have gangs when I became a teenager, but before that, I didn't know of any gangs. But it wasn't, crime was not anything. You never heard of a policeman getting shot or things like that. Children played out in the street till 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night. Because I used to walk down to 125th to the 5 and 10 when I was 7 years old. You didn't have to worry about children. Boys played loadies, girls jumped rope, skate. You know, we were children, and we communicated with one another. But then when I became a teenager and moved up on Sugar Hill, there was gang fights between the Irish boys and the cemetery, Trinity on 155th and Riverside Drive. These boys hid behind tombstones and jumped out on, I think it was Halloween, with these stockings with flour in it, beating each other up. It wasn't guns and shooting and, well, I mean zip guns. Maybe they made these little zip guns that they had, but it was nothing, you know, street life. There was number racket. Everybody played numbers, illegal numbers. I have a joke about that. I have a relative who is now 97 years old this month. She also does poetry readings. And when she was a young woman, you know, people were out of work and people would take anything. And she was taking the numbers, you know, people played 2 cents, give me a nickel, combination, and this and that. And she left me downstairs at 110th and 7th Avenue with a baby carriage with her son. I was a few years older, I was about 4 years old. And she went upstairs to turn in the money and she got busted. And she said she had to, please let me go. I have 2 children downstairs. I'm just trying to make a living with this money. So Daisy said they let her go eventually. She came down. I was frozen. I was standing there holding on to the carriage, frozen, wintertime, you know, cold. But everybody played numbers. So there was number racket, but it wasn't the drug racket. And if there was, it was mostly with people that had money or were into entertainment, right? It was nothing like it is, nothing, street life. Even hustlers had respect for each other. You know, it was nothing, I mean, there were, you know, people in rackets, but you didn't know about them that much. It was not wide open, or you didn't hear about it, you didn't know what was going on.
Sir?
Did you dance at the original Cotton Club?
No, those women are in the 80s and 90s. I'm a kid compared to them. I'll be 74 July 26th. So, Lena Horne was a Cotton Club girl. And these girls, Yeah, but most of the Cotton Club girls were very fair.
Yeah.
I think Louis Armstrong's wife had to fight because she passed the audition and they didn't want to accept her.
And
That's right.
But she got in
Yeah. I know,
because she
he
was
yeah.
a great dancer.
but she was dark-skinned, right?
Yes.
And it was only
And they
light-skinned
were so
Yeah.
prejudiced. The racism was always there, you know, it was always, I remember there was a man, he used to live in my building, and he would get so drunk. He'd be laid out in the street. Next day I'd see him on Mr. Peepers.
Yes.
He was an actor.
Yeah, Mr. Peters.
Yes, he was in Mr. Peepers. And he would say, little girl, you ought to go downtown and get into SAG, you know? And that's one regret that I have. I was supposed to be in a movie with Sammy Davis, the man with the golden arm. I had just finished dancing at a club called the Blue Bunny off of 45th Street. And I was pregnant with my son who was sitting over there. And I didn't know it. I didn't know I was pregnant at the time, so I went to this agent, and it was a woman agent. And she had the door open, and a young man went in and she said, do you belong to the union? And he said, yes, I do. She had 6 phones on her desk. She picked up, he said, oh, no, I'm sorry, I don't believe. And all I could hear her say was, why did you lie? The next thing he left. So I said, I'm going in very humbly. So I went in and I said, I have very little acting experience, but even if it's a walk-on part. She said, you're a very tall girl, aren't you? And I said, yes. She said, would you walk across the floor? And I did. She said, I think we may be able to use you. I'll take your phone number. Unfortunately, when the lady called, my family was never really interested in me dancing. My sister never gave me the message till the next day. Oh, God. So when I jumped on the phone and called the lady about 10 o'clock, the lady said, I'm sorry, but we wanted you on the set out here in Brooklyn this morning. Wow. And see, that shows you're unreliable. You see, and that was one thing that I really regretted because I had gone, my boyfriend and I used to go down to the Paramount, the Roxy. Yes. We would walk out of one movie and go into another. And I saw Frank Sinatra when he was skinny. And at the Paramount when he married Ava Gardner. And the stage would come up slowly from the pit. And the whole stage was covered with red and white roses to Ava and Frankie. And they said, we have this young guy here that's coming out, and it's the Will Maston Trio. And that was Sammy Davis, the unknown Sammy Davis at the time. And he tap danced, and he did comedy, and he did, he could act like other people, what was the girl that, impersonations. Who's this guy? His name is Sammy Davis. That's his father and his uncle. And I had always wanted to work with Sammy. And one of my idols, as you see I have my flower in my hair, was Lady Day. I just loved and adored her because I'd seen her at the Paramount hanging on. She was heavy on drugs, you know, and she'd be holding on to the mic and she would be singing, and I just loved her singing. She took away her cabaret license, because at that time we had to have a cabaret license in order to work in a nightclub, which they eventually eliminated the cabaret license. I heard they're trying to bring it back again.
Just very quickly, I was wondering, did you have any type of interaction with Catherine Dunham?
I didn't know Catherine Dunham. I knew a lot of her dances, like Eartha Kitt. I did a story on Eartha Kitt, did a one-woman show down at 92nd Street Y, playing a bag lady. And a lot of people seemed surprised when Eartha Kitt said she was on the streets homeless at one time. But she was. She was also banned from working here in New York for a while, but I'll get to that. Eartha Kitt was one of Catherine Dunham's dancers, and she went on tour to England, and Orson Welles took an interest in Eartha Kitt as a dancer. and sent for her after she got back to the States. Eartha Kitt came a far away from the streets of Harlem. She came here to her aunt, to live with her aunt, and she ran away. And she was on the streets for a while. But for her to go as far as to sit down and talk with Churchill, can you imagine? And just like I had a dream, too. You see, I knew Alvin Ailey, and, you know, you run in circles, like most musicians know musicians, most dancers. But I did her 80th birthday at the Schoenberg, where all the dancers came out, and she was in a wheelchair. That's when I met, what's this guy's name, his father, the actor, Show Me the Money.
Oh, Cuba Gooding and his father was.
Cuba Gooding and his father and his brother was there that evening. I was introduced to Cuba Gooding and his brother and father, and she was, you know, just came out the hospital and she was in a wheelchair. That's the closest I ever came to meeting Catherine Dunham, but I always admired what she did in Haiti. She fell in love with Haiti. She was a beautiful woman, a beautiful dancer.
Did I see another hand up in the back? No? Yes, well, oh, yes, sir, I'm sorry.
I want to know, did you know Charles Cookie Cook? And if so, tell us anything about him.
What was the name?
Cook,
Charles
of
Cookie.
Cook and Brown.
Cook and Brown.
I knew of them, but the name is so familiar to me, Charles
Across
Cook.
the hall for Hyacinth. You know Miss Hyacinth?
It
Cotton Club
sound,
lady?
they sound very
You look
familiar to me, but I don't know. I know of them. You know, it's, you know, years go by, you somehow forget, you know?
I'd like to ask you a quick question about Buck and Bubbles. Did you ever see Buck and Bubbles?
I saw them at the Apollo all the time.
Could you describe their act? What made them, because I've heard that they were kind of like close to the top of those kind of acts. What was it about Buck and Bubbles that was so special?
Well, I really can't explain. You know, everybody had their own style, you know? Like Peg Leg Bates, and he danced with a peg leg.
Sure.
He never got prosthesis, he just used the peg and tapped. And they did sort of a comedy in their act, I believe, too. It's going back a long way for me to remember exactly everybody's act.
Did you have one, another question, sir?
Yeah, going back to street life, can you tell us something about the musical culture of the streets at that time?
The question was about the musical culture of the streets, going back to the street life, the musical
Well, it
culture.
wasn't hip-hop, that didn't exist. That did not exist.
So what was it?
The music, as I said, was, in my era, was jazz. But what these kids are doing now called swing dancing, everybody went to the clubs to do the Lindy Hop and the Jitterbug. It was dancing with a partner. That's the type of music, well, at first it was Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, but then we have the, you know, the jazz era comes in. I'd say in the 40s, was it, when jazz really started taking over. So that was my era. You see, it was the jazz era. And that's why I'm here at the Jazz Museum. Yeah, but
Sir?
Yes.
There was a time in Harlem, it was very important music-wise, you had the marching bands.
well, Louis Armstrong started in New Orleans in a marching band
In Harlem.
because he had gotten in some trouble and was put into this sort of home. And he started with the marching band,
But
just
they had
like,
them here in Harlem, though? I'm just curious about that.
well, I don't know about in Harlem about marching band, but what's the name was here last?
Joe Wilder is right over
Joe
there.
Wilder's right here, he could tell you about the marching band,
I think he was, I think he was mentioning.
right?
That's right. I'm sure he could.
Actually, there were a lot of marching bands, but that came from the military thing, actually, because the music, a lot of the early ragtime stuff was based on a lot of the marches and themes and things that they got from that particular era. I don't know the chronology of it exactly, but that's one of the areas in which it started to develop. You got a lot of people like.
But didn't they have the armory, and they would have these young men that used to do this marching in armory?
Well,
in Harlem?
they were like
Yeah, the 69th Regiment.
reservists, and they had to drill
Yes.
every so many weeks out of the year or something, and that's why they trained at the armories, and they had the marching bands, which were of course Navy bands, Army bands, and Marine Corps units, but they were, most of those were reservists.
But that's the only marching band that I knew of. You mentioned ragtime, that was U.B. Blake's type of music.
That's true.
The ragtime, I love that music too.
Tajah, I want to thank you so much. The building is going to be closing in about 30 minutes, and I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to talk to you, because I think I see a whole bunch of folks who want to come up and say hello, who want to look at the pictures. And I just want to say, in closing here, what a great honor it's been to have you here tonight, and that you may be turning 74 in a few weeks, but you're one of the youngest spirits I've ever met in my life. And I consider it a blessing that Bert brought us together. Thank you so much.
And I want to thank everybody. It's been my pleasure to talk about the past, and especially about Harlem, because it's very dear to my heart.
And I'd like to present you with a copy of our Harlem Speaks photo.
Oh, wonderful.
This is my lucky day.